So here at Cabra Wetlands we have a cosmic walk, which is essentially our creation story as we understand it now. It's a story that has been emerging probably over the last 50 years, in truth. And a lot of it is contained in this book called The Universe Story, which was written by Thomas Berry, who's a cultural historian, and Brian Swim, who's a mathematical cosmologist. So they pulled it all together in that book. And actually the Irish version of that story, if you like, from an Irish perspective, is written by a lady, it's Nellie McLaughlin, Out of Wonder. It's the same, it's an easier book to read actually. So our creation story is very important for us to try and understand our place in the web of life. Thomas Berry in his time lamented that Western culture was without a creation story. Now we have one, and it really is very important, I think, that we make ourselves more familiar with it and be guided to some extent by it. Our creation story as we understand it now is based on 4 wisdoms. It's based on the wisdom of science, the wisdom of women, the wisdom of indigenous people, and the wisdom of the classical tradition. What science is telling us is that we start off here with this first sculpture, that 13.8 billion years ago there was a great burst of light and energy. That's what science is telling us, and that was the beginning of everything as we know it. So this is essentially about story. It's our creation story, and of course the time spans involved are huge. So what we understand again from science essentially is that for almost 1 billion years it seemed that little enough was happening. And then after that time, hydrogen and helium came together to form the first matter. And so you have the emergence of the first generation of stars, which are represented in this sculpture here. So here we are at the 3rd sculpture on our cosmic walk, and the story goes on, and the time spans again continue to be enormous. From the previous sculpture to this one is over 7 billion years, because we're now down to 4.6 billion years ago. That first generation of stars died, and when a star dies it's called a supernova. It implodes, and in that implosion it creates enormously high temperatures. And during that process, out of that process, if you like, a new generation of stars emerge. But they're different from the first generation of stars because now they contain elements that the first generation of stars didn't have, particularly like carbon and iron that were formed in those high temperatures. So this is what we have here, is the emergence of the second generation of stars, if you like, including our solar system. So we keep talking about story and about periods of time. We have to remember that we're trying to cover a 13.8 billion year span in 13 sculptures really. So the periods of time in between each sculpture, between each event are enormous. And it does need to be said that a lot was happening all of the time. We have to understand that the journey of the universe as we understand it now, it was a journey from light and energy to life, to diversity of life, to conscious life. So that's an enormous journey. It's an enormous sequence of events that had to happen. And so even though the time span is enormous, there was a lot happening each step along the way, all of the time. We have arrived now at basically into the Middle Ages. So we've gone from a period, well, not into the Middle Ages, I'm sorry, about 3.9 billion years ago. We've gone from a period of the emergence of our solar system about 4.6 billion years ago, to the emergence of life about 3.9 billion years ago. Judy Kanata, in her book Radical Amazement, she makes a lovely point. I think that she said that, you know, for hundreds of thousands of years the sun was shining on the earth, and the earth was just bare rock. Nothing was happening. And then, as I've been saying, over a period of time, for a combination of reasons, the earth learned to take the energy of the sun and turn it into food, which we call photosynthesis. Now, that was an enormous event, as you can imagine. An enormous event, certainly for us on Earth. Because, of course, when you really think about it, the sun is the energy source in our solar system. So the sun powers everything. So the food that we eat is essentially the sun's energy. So when you had your breakfast this morning or dinner today, essentially you're eating the energy of the sun. That is what energizes us. It's kind of interesting when we get to the around the Middle Ages, and you had people like Copernicus and Galileo and so on, and they were starting to develop. Telescopes were beginning to develop at that time, and they were able to look into the night sky, and they began to suggest that just maybe that the earth revolved around the sun, that we were not the center of the universe as we had thought, as our ancestors had thought up to that time. They thought that for very understandable reasons, because you got up in the morning and the sun was in the east, and it went over us during the day, and by night time it went down in the west. So to suggest that we were the center of everything was not an unusual suggestion. But these early people looking into the night sky began to suggest, no, maybe the earth revolves around the sun. And like all change, there was lots of early deniers that just couldn't accept that. And there's a story told at one time that Galileo himself asked some of the doubters, look, come and have a look into the telescope and see for yourself that in fact the earth is revolving around the sun. And they refused to look into the telescope. And I find that very interesting in terms of, as a metaphor for today, what are we refusing to look at in our time? Information that we know, information that we have, and yet we're refusing to take it on board. Because change is difficult, there's no doubt about that. Just finally, maybe just to mention that in his lifetime's work, Thomas Berry was a Passionist priest. And after he was ordained, he went to work in China, and then under Mao Zedong at the time, all religious people were expelled from China. So he came back to the States, really back to the Riverdale Institute, and spent his life working on this type of work. So we can be grateful to people like Thomas Berry, of course, and Brian Swim for the work that they have done to increase our understanding about our universe, about our emergence of the earth, and about our place in that whole great story. At the beginning I said that our creation story is based on 4 wisdoms. The wisdom of science, the wisdom of women, the wisdom of indigenous people, and the wisdom of the classical tradition. So what we've tried to do in creating this cosmic walk is we've tried to interweave those various wisdoms into the story as we went along. So this particular sculpture here is it's one that I like very much, because it is saying it's based on an insight actually by a man called James Lovelock. And James Lovelock is still alive, a NASA scientist, and he was asked one time to see if or not there was life on Mars. And he said at that time, before we go looking for life on Mars, we do well to understand better how life works on Earth. So they studied life on Earth for a while, and they came up with a very simple insight, if you like. And it is that life on Earth works because it all works together. And I think that's very challenging for us. And if you want to understand anything about ecology, I think we have to accept that that's how the world has emerged over these billions of years. as an interdependent and interconnected community of life. On the side of this sculpture here, we dedicated to a lady called Mary Anning. She was a famous fossil collector and made some very significant finds that are still in the British Museum today. But essentially, I think to understand anything about ecology, anything about a response to our environmental challenges at the present time, we have to have concern for all species, because that's how the earth works. It all works together. So we dedicated this sculpture to Rachel Carson, who wrote a famous book called Silent Spring. There's different people who went out of their way, I think, to draw our attention to environmental issues in their time. And Rachel Carson was very concerned about the impact of DDT at that time. And the experience was that birds were laying eggs, but the shells were very soft. So when the mother sat on the eggs, they broke, basically. So chicks were not hatching out. Hence the title of our book, Silent Spring. And I'm conscious as I speak this morning, there's a bird singing gloriously there in the trees. So if we didn't have that, how poor we would be without it. On this sculpture also, we're celebrating that 500 million years ago, eyesight emerged as part of our journey, part of the story. What science would say is that it was a little insect in the bottom of the ocean called a trilobite. It was probably one of the first little insects to develop eyesight at that time. And of course, eyesight has continued. They would say that when nature learns something useful, it never forgets. So eyesight has continued to be a part of creation and all sorts of different types of eyes and so on. But Thomas Berry makes the point, that if by some magic we could survive on the moon, we would have dull grey personalities, because the moon is a grey and silent landscape. But we don't live on the moon, and especially because of our senses, our eyesight and our smell and so on, that we are constantly looking. Just as I speak now, the sun is breaking through, and our eyesight is inviting us into that whole world of light, and our hearing into the whole world of sound and so on. And you can finish by saying that we are as we are because the earth is as it is. There's a sense that we think we shape the earth, but in reality, because of the influences around us, the earth shapes us. So 425 years ago, life moves on to land. That's our next sculpture. Of course, what's amazing about our story is that we have been on this journey for billions of years. And within the last 500 million years, life is only emerging from the oceans. Of course, that must have taken a huge, you could speak all day if you understood it well enough of how organisms could survive both in the water and on land. And that took a very long time for conditions to be such that life could exist on land and could breed on land and so on. But gradually it began to happen, and the chemistry of the atmosphere around the earth began to be shaped by that life emerging from the oceans. I suppose the other thing we were trying to say in this sculpture as well is that it's been such an extraordinary journey. Our story is such a wonderful story that it's no harm to stop and look back. That old expression is only when you stop and look back you realise how far you've come. So this is a kind of a pause as well to contemplate the journey and to try and take it in, because it is a marvellous journey. It's an extraordinary story. Our story is an extraordinary story. So, on this one we're celebrating the emergence of mammals about 260 million years ago. What's significant about mammals really would be that they give birth to live young and they feed them from their own bodies. And bonding and nurturing will become a very important feature of the mammal family. Now when we speak of mammals, we're probably speaking of these little shrew-like type creatures which are very plentiful here in the wetlands. We're talking about the very early days of mammals, but significant just the same, because it is coming into our family tree. What we also want to celebrate here at this sculpture is a quote from Thomas Berry, which a theme running through our cosmic story, is that my concern is for the children of all species. It's almost like getting back to that notion of the freestanding stones, that it works because it all works together. It's a key feature of ecology, again, that notion of interdependence, interconnectedness of all of life. And we're becoming more aware of that, and even we're becoming more aware of how common that is throughout creation. So in this one here, we're celebrating the fact that about 150 million years ago, birds fly. So birds have taken to the air a long time ago. This lovely sculpture is kind of like, it's almost like you're taking off. We have a quote from Brian Swim which says, "The earth was once molten rock and now it sings operas." So that's part of the journey. The earth was once molten rock, but now there's beautiful bird song here this morning to be enjoyed. We do well to remember that birds have been migrating for a long time and making those journeys for a long time and learning to live. We have lots of swallows flying around here now, which have come to us from southern Africa to enjoy the insect life that's available here at this time of the year. On the other hand, we have a whole other family of range of birds like the redwing and the fieldfare and the curlew and the lapwing and so on. They've all gone up to Scandinavia to rear their young for the summer, because the longer days up there and the plentiful food supply suits them. So birds have learned to crisscross the globe a very long time ago, and they've been doing it ever since. So this is a very important sculpture for us, of course, because it's saying that 2.5 million years ago, roughly, the first humans evolved. But more significantly, within the last, I suppose, 100,000 years, our ancestors, 80 to 100,000 years, have migrated out of Africa, across the Middle East, and essentially spread around the world. That is very, very recent. We all have Africa, if you like, in our DNA. It's where our ancestors evolved and began to emerge and so on. What DNA evidence is now suggesting, actually, that there was a concern for a long time that the first thing our ancestors did when they left Africa was to wipe out the Neanderthal people that lived in Europe at that time. What DNA evidence is now suggesting is that, in fact, they set up home together, and that all of us Europeans have maybe between 5 and 8% Neanderthal DNA in our systems as well, which kind of puts that argument to bed. African people would be pure Homo sapien. They didn't come across the Neanderthal at that time. But those of us who did, there is that evidence that says that we have some Neanderthal DNA in our system. So what we're celebrating here is that about 6,000 years ago, great civilizations and religions emerged. What we've focused on in this sculpture is that whole, the beauty of indigenous wisdom. And we have two words here which capture that very much, is contemplation and celebration. It's written on the stones here. And the wisdom behind that really is that, that with contemplation, once you stop to consider what it is we are part of, the beauty of the world around us, that interconnectedness, the interdependence we keep talking about, how much we get from the world around us. Once we stop to consider that, the only appropriate response is gratitude. And I think our indigenous ancestors, who were far more connected to the world around them than we are, had a deeper appreciation of that, of how much we receive from the world around us. And that gratitude is an appropriate response to have. We have come to the last sculpture on our cosmic walk. And can I just say at this time that at the beginning I talked about this cosmic walk is based on work by Brian Swim and Thomas Berry in their book called Universe Story. But actually the idea for this cosmic walk, credit must be given to a lady called Miriam McGillis of Genesis Farm in New Jersey. And she was looking at this whole story, and her idea was to try and create an experience for people and to try and make all that information, if you like, accessible to people through a walk and through telling a story. So credit goes to Miriam McGillis for that. Our final sculpture, our piece, is also our first piece, but it's our final piece because what we have done here is we have water inside in this piece of stone. And if you look in on the water, what you will see is your own reflection. And what we're trying to get across here is that science is telling us that energy cannot be created or destroyed, it just changes form. So when you look into the water and see your own reflection, we can say to people with confidence that the energy in your body was created at the very beginning, 13.8 billion years ago. So was the energy in the bird, and so was the energy in the tree, and in all of creation. So that's how closely connected we all are. We're all connected by that same energy that unites all creation and runs right through. For our Celtic ancestors, they spoke of the notion of Njart as the life force in all of creation. And for our ancestors in the Irish tradition, Njart was always sacred. Our cosmic walk is essentially story, and it's about just trying to make the information that is now out there available to us in story form, that we can hold it and we can allow it to shape our lives and shape our attitude and shape our perspective on creation. We are part of it. We are, Chief Seattle said a long time ago, we are but a strand in the web of life. That turns out to be true. We are nature too. So it's understanding our story is going to help us to understand our place in the web of life.